Okay, just a reminder that if you have a question, please enter it. It doesn't have to be the complete question, just enter the question in the chat thread, and then I will call on you in the approximate order, assuming I don't make mistakes, which I do. But that way we don't interrupt the speaker and don't end up talking over each other. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate Calvin, who's going to talk about biogeochemistry group, and that'll be followed by Ben Bond-Lamberty with a closely associated land energy NGD. Okay, Kate, all yours.
Thanks, Dave. Before I start, I just want to say one thing that's happened since the last all hands meeting in the fall is that we've added a second deputy group lead for biogeochemistry, Jennifer Holmes. I just want to welcome Jennifer and thank her for helping. And so she's contributed to this presentation as well as Susanna Burrows, the other deputy. So I just want to start very, very quickly just to give people a sense of the goals of the biogeochemistry group in case you haven't been following closely. And so one of our primary goals is to understand Earth system variability and change and its interactions with biogeochemical cycles. So we look at things like how climate affects terrestrial carbon storage and ocean carbon uptake and how those feed back onto climate again. The second goal we have is simulations, predictions, and projections to support the DOE's energy mission. So changes in the Earth system, including some of the science drivers Ruby mentioned last week for BGC on heat extremes and wildfire, have implications for energy production and use. And so we're interested in understanding that within the BGC group. So our overarching science question for biogeochemistry in E3SM is how do biogeochemical cycles interact with other Earth system components to influence energy sector decisions? And so I just wanted to give that as some framing before I go into what we've been up to lately and where we're planning to go. So this is a timeline overall. Includes some non-BGC stuff, so the gray NGD developments are happening in other groups, and you'll hear about those in other presentations, but just where we're going from. And so within the two red vertical bars where the phase 2 activities are, we've been working simultaneously on completing V1 simulations and writing papers documenting those simulations, as well as on V2, we've been doing testing and integration of V2 model features, and we'll move into going forward our V2 simulation campaign, which includes spin up first and then simulations and paper writing. We're also in anticipation of phase 3, we've been thinking a little bit about where V3 and phase 3 will go, and just as how does that influence what we're doing today. And so what I'm going to talk about today is go through some updates on the V1 simulations and papers, an overview of where we're at on the V2 simulation campaign and model development, and then looking forward, both in terms of where we're going to go forward with V2 and also thinking about phase 3. So first, on V1 simulations and analysis. For the V1 simulation campaign, the science question that we were focused on in the biogeochemistry group was, what are the effects of nitrogen and phosphorus on climate biogeochemistry interactions, and how sensitive are these interactions to model structural uncertainty? And I've highlighted in red two parts of this question that we're going to really be looking at. One is about nutrient limits on climate and biogeochemistry. The second is on model structural uncertainty. And so our simulation campaign was designed to disentangle these two things. And where we're at with that, we've run thousands of years of coupled simulations. We have 2 papers published from the VGC V1 model and simulation campaign, and we have several other papers in progress. And so I'm just going to give a highlight, first of all, on one of the papers. This is a Susanna Burrows-led paper documenting the biogeochemistry model. And within this paper, Susanna and the team have evaluated the model using observational benchmarks, and I'll show some of that. And that sort of informed a lot of our V2 development and direction in terms of model development. We've also used in this paper characterizing ecosystem climate responses in a standard set of simulations, including quantifying the effects of structural uncertainty and nutrient limits. So those last 2 things, structural uncertainty and nutrient limits, were part of our science questions. And this overview paper looked at those 2 parts in the historical period. I'm not going to show specific results from that today. I'll show instead some additional analysis since this paper looking at those 2 elements. So just to give a sense of where the model was, I'll start first with the land model. First, to get at structural uncertainty, we actually ran two different versions of the land model. So one we're calling here CTC and the other ECA, and they have to do with soil biogeochemistry and some differences in vegetation as well. This figure on the right here is showing its ILAM summary results. And so ILAM is a benchmarking package that looks at land model results. Each row of these is a different variable. The colors are indicating how well a particular model variable combination compared to to observations, with red meaning worse and blue meaning better. The two versions of E3SM biogeochemistry model are the two columns on the right. The columns on the left are the CMIP5 models. And so in general, the two E3SM models performed better than CMIP5 across a wide range of metrics. So the land model is good. We've also evaluated the ocean carbon biogeochemistry in the V1 paper and analysis. And here the figure I'm showing is the model is on the panel A and the observations are panel B. Red colors are fluxes out of the ocean, blue colors are uptake into the ocean. And what you can see here is when you sum it up globally, the benchmark data that we use is 150 petagrams of carbon per year plus or minus 20 petagrams of carbon per year. In E3SM V1 BGC is below that, so below the uncertainty range by a fair amount. So only getting about 93 petagrams carbon per year. So it was a little bit low on the carbon uptake. And this is sort of when we've looked into why we were low in V1. What we find is that some of this has to do with physics. So the model physics actually affect the carbon uptake and fluxes quite a bit. Some of it also had to do with things like river nutrients. And so lining up where fresh water and nutrients come into the ocean will affect carbon uptake and ocean biogeochemistry. And so those are two areas that I'll come back to later that we focused on trying to improve for the V2 model to improve these biases. In addition to evaluating the model, what we're doing now is we've got a series of papers that are further getting at our science question. So looking at implications of phosphorus and nutrient limitations on the carbon cycle. And so this, I'm showing some example results from two papers that are in prep. The top row is a paper led by Peter Thornton using the CTC version of the BGC model. And here what he's looking at is he's run the same set of simulations. These are a set of simulations designed by the international modeling community to disentangle the effect of climate and carbon on carbon. So looking at just if CO2 concentrations go up or just if temperature changes or the combination. And what does that mean for carbon uptake on land or ocean? And these figures are just showing terrestrial carbon uptake. And what we've done is run those same set of simulations with and without phosphorus limits. So the red lines on that top row of figures are if you include phosphorus limits. The black lines are if you don't. And so then you can compare across those two things to get a sense of what does phosphorus do to carbon uptake. And so if you look at the top left figure, this is how much terrestrial carbon uptake you get per unit of CO2 concentration increase. So higher values mean more carbon uptake. And here you see what you expect, that without phosphorus limitations, you get more carbon uptake. But that effect is small and it goes away over time. So as you get closer to 2100, there's less difference in carbon uptake with phosphorus limits than without. And you're seeing some similar things. The middle panel is looking at how much carbon you lose per unit of temperature rise, and you get a similar thing. So less negative means less carbon loss, and you see less negative when you don't include phosphorus limits, but that goes away over time as well. The bottom row is a paper that's being led by Qing Zhu using the ECA model. And here he's taking a different approach to the same question. So what is the effect of phosphorus or other nutrient limits on carbon cycle? But rather than repeating the same set of simulations, he's first of all looking across space and time within a single simulation to try to get at this particular question. The second thing that he's really looking at is about legacy effects. So in the simulations that Peter ran, they branch in 1850 as to whether they include changes in CO2 concentration or temperature. Qing is looking at, well, what if we now branch in 2030 instead of 1850? Do you get a different answer for this if you've started from a different point? So he's looking at legacy, and then he's also looking at nutrient limitations in a different way, but the same general question. We have a third paper on the land that's getting at the structural uncertainty, and I don't have any results from that yet, but Ben Bond-Lamberty will be leading a paper on that to get at that part of the question. So that's where we've been doing on the V1. I'll now move a little into the V2 simulation campaign, and I want to start by talking about the V2 model and then go into the simulation campaign. There we go. But just first, the model is going to be slightly different than the V1 model, both because we've improved things and reduced biases, but also because we have a different science question. And so the V2 science question is, what are the implications of different energy futures for biogeochemical cycle through changes in land use, land cover, water availability, and extreme events? And so here, what we do for the V2 BGC model is first, we start from the water cycle version. So all of the physics and performance updates that Chris talked about last week are included in the V2 BGC model. Similarly, as Chris mentioned, that there's going to be two versions of that model, a low res and a regionally refined version. We'll use both of those in the BGC campaign as well. And part of the reason we do this is we want all of the improvements that they've made, but also we want to start from a tuned model. So we rely on Chris and the water cycle team to tune the model initially. We do have to do some adjustments to it based on changes we made, but the basic tunings and are provided to us. What we do then is we turn on active biogeochemistry in atmosphere, land, ocean, and sea ice. And by doing this, we can then model the carbon cycle and its interactions with climate, which is required for our science questions. And so what we've done here is, in addition to getting all of the updates from the water cycle, we also make updates that are BGC specific. And I'll just highlight a few things that we've been targeting in order to improve biases or add features for the V2 biogeochemistry campaign. So these are just key differences. This is not a complete list. So first of all, in ocean, as I mentioned before, that we had a low carbon uptake compared to observations. And so here, what we've done is, first of all, the improvements in ocean physics we think will really help quite a bit with these biases. And then we're also doing some improved river nutrients to reduce those biases as well. The second thing here, so the biogeochemistry model is much more expensive than the water cycle model. Once you turn on all of this active biogeochemistry, you're adding a bunch of tracers throughout the coupled system, and that it reduces runtime. And so one of the things that Luke mentioned yesterday that Kat Smith and Andrew Bradley have been working on is super cycling. And this will improve model performance. So it's doing tracer advection of ocean biogeochemistry at a different time step than the physics or the coupling time step. And that allows the model to go faster. On the land side, we're just doing a single model configuration, so we're just going to use the CTC version. We are evaluating some additional changes to the land model that are more water cycle related, but due to timing, they're potentially going to be included in the BGC version, and that includes irrigation, water management, inundation, subgrid topography, and plant hydraulics. We also have, as part of our interest both now and in looking forward, are looking at dynamic vegetation and crops. And so we're planning to use the V2 model to test these features as they exist now in offline simulation mode, just to get a sense of how they're performing and how they affect carbon and climate, or carbon, I guess, just since they're an offline model. For the atmosphere model, the BGC V2 simulations are going to include prognostic CO2. This is different than what we did in V1 and what is done in the water cycle. And so in both V1 and the water cycle, you read in a CO2 concentration, and that's what's used both for in the V1 BGC campaign for terrestrial carbon uptake and ocean changes, as well as climate. What we're doing in V2 is we're going to calculate the CO2 concentration dynamically from the terrestrial and ocean fluxes and anthropogenic emissions of CO2. This requires more spin up of the land and ocean components because the biases in carbon fluxes matter more, and so it's now going to affect your CO2 concentration. And so we need to be a lot more careful about spin up there. And then on the energy side, we're going to be coupling GChem to E3SM, and this will allow us to both look more directly at energy sector decisions, which is one of our goals. It also allows us to have another, we can do human or system feedbacks. This is where we can get the CO2 emissions and land use, land cover change to drive E3SM. So just because most people here don't know what GChem is, I thought we'd we thought I'd throw in one slide just as a quick summary of it. So it is a global model linking economy, energy, land, water, and climate systems. It's generally used to look at the effect of technology and policy, but more recently climate on the effect of on these systems. It calculates the emissions, anthropogenic emissions for 24 greenhouse gases and short-lived species. So all of the ones that you would use to drive an Earth system model. It runs through 2100, usually in 5-year time steps, but we can run it in 1-year time step for the E3SM coupling, and it is open source. It is a regionally resolved model, and so there is a bunch of code that we've got to put in to couple it to GCAM that actually, or to E3SM that actually take it from regional down to a grid to drive E3SM there. One last thing, when you run GCAM offline, there's a reduced form climate model called Hector that's included. We turn that off when we couple to E3SM and use E3SM instead. So our simulation campaign for V2, we're going to do this in 2 simulation modes. First is one-way coupling. So this is the standard CMIP where you pass emissions and land use land cover into the Earth system model as boundary conditions. The second is a 2-way coupling with these human Earth system interactions. So there you'll take the land use land cover and emissions from GCAM to drive E3SM, and then E3SM will send climate information back to GCAM, which will affect energy and land decisions and subsequently emissions and land use land cover change. So you can capture these 2-way feedbacks. And so for every simulation we'll repeat it with and without these feedbacks turned on. In terms of specific future simulations, we are definitely going to do a high and low emissions world because these are really interesting from a carbon standpoint and testing the different components of the coupled system. We also will probably do a intermediate emissions scenario and looking at different land use land cover change because that will really exercise the coupling that we've got in there. There's still a little bit of details to be worked out here. It's a little bit less, so we don't actually use this CMIP6 scenarios directly. We generate them endogenously within the coupled E3SM GCAM, so we have a little bit more flexibility, which leads to more options in this particular sense. In addition to these core simulations to answer the science question, we also want to understand the effective model features and forcing factors. So we're going to do a series of sensitivity experiments, including initial conditions with and without fates. This is the dynamic vegetation model, with and without crops, with and without regionally refined. And the regionally refined we think could be really interesting in the ocean carbon uptake side. What happens if you've got different model resolution there, particularly around the coasts? So the last thing I want to talk, or second to last thing I want to talk about is just a little bit about going forward. So unlike the water cycle model, once we finalize our model, we then have to go through a roughly year-long spin-up process. And so I thought I would just talk about it a little bit. In this figure, I'm showing 3 different sort of channels. One is ocean, then land, then coupled. And within each, I'm going to talk about low res and RRM because we have to spin up both. And the reason that there's 3 ocean, land, and coupled is that because of the expense of the model and the way that the models work, you start by spinning up offline ocean, then offline land, and then you put it together in a coupled model. You don't start with the coupled model and spin up from the start. And from the ocean side, because it takes a really long time for water to turn over and the ocean to mix, you have to do a really, really long spin up to get all of the carbon fluxes into equilibrium. And so we are currently planning on doing 3,000 years of offline low res ocean spin up. We'll then use that to initialize an RRM ocean and we'll run that to equilibrium, and I'll come back to what equilibrium means. On the land side, soil and other aspects of land also take a while to spin up, but here in the land model, we have an option to turn on what's called accelerated decomposition that speeds up all of that mixing and carbon decomposition. And so then we can move through the spin up mode much more quickly. And so in V1, we did about 800 to 1,000 years of offline land spin up. We're anticipating doing something roughly the same there. After that, we actually turn on land plus atmosphere. And here we end up doing a little bit of minor retuning because once you turn on VGC in the land, you actually end up changing the climate a little bit. And so we had to do a little bit of retuning in V1, and we're anticipating doing that again. Then you can put everything together into the coupled model. And if we're lucky, then we can just run that out until we hit equilibrium. However, some of the experiences that Peter and Matt have had in the past is that you can end up with some basically creating a carbon pump if your end of your offline spin-ups end up in a particular case. So if you've got like a small uptake in the ocean and a small outgassing in the land, once you put them together in a coupled model, you can basically just end up passing carbon through the atmosphere from one component to the other, and you won't actually hit equilibrium. And so what's been done in the past when that's happened is you iterate back and forth between coupled and uncoupled spin-up. And so we might need to do that. We'll evaluate as we go for there. But again, overall, we're expecting that this process will take about a year to get spun up. And when spun up means is we actually have some quantitative criteria that determine whether or not the model is in equilibrium. So for both ocean and land, we're looking at a global carbon flux, and we want it to be less than 10 petagrams carbon per century. And this is a criteria that's coming out of the C4 MIP protocol. For land, though, we in addition want to look at more regional dynamics, because it's possible to get to that global criteria and still have particular regions or grid cells that are really out of balance. And so here we want to look at how many grid cells are out of carbon balance by a particular threshold and use that as a regional criteria. So back to the overall timeline, like I said, that spin up will start in hopefully a couple of months, and then we'll do that for a year before we can start doing simulations and paper writing. So just in anticipation, this is not going to start because of how long it takes to do spin up. We actually expect that the phase 3 proposal will be submitted before the spin up is complete. And so in anticipation of that, we're actually working on demonstrations of the V2 model that can be completed prior to having the couple model spin up complete. And so I'll just mention a couple of those. One is on Xiaofeng at PNNL is working on a land atmosphere comp set that includes prognostic CO2. So you read in a carbon flux from the ocean, and you can use that to get a sense of how does the atmosphere handle prognostic CO2 before we've got a fully spun up climate model. Secondly, we can also think about on the GCAM coupling, we'd like to demonstrate that in advance. And so looking at like an ELM plus GCAM comp set and doing some simulations with that just to demonstrate that that coupling works. And so we're looking into doing those as we go. And then lastly, just in anticipation of the V3 science campaign, we've been coordinating with a lot of the NGD efforts and making plans to evaluate relevant aspects of the V2 model in anticipation of that. And so Xiaocheng mentioned this with atmospheric chemistry yesterday. So the atmospheric physics NGD is developing atmospheric chemistry, and part of that will be prognostic methane. Well, in order to use the prognostic methane, we need to understand, where the terrestrial methane flux is coming from, and how does that work. And so we're planning on evaluating the V2 model in the next year, just to understand how it performs before we get to that part. So I will stop here and take questions.
Thank you, Kate. I don't see anything in the chat line. Does anybody? Peter Caldwell says, I have a question. So once he corrects his English, I'm sure he can go ahead and answer.
I was typing quick. So this is probably a really, really stupid question, kind of like my stupid typing, but so is the phosphorus and nitrogen work that you did for V1, is that really critical for the V2 work, or are they kind of orthogonal? So if you, in other words, if you leave out phosphorus and nitrogen stuff that you're doing in your V2 simulations, will you get wildly different answers?
If you just exclude the nutrient limitations, you would either need to recalibrate the model in some way, or you would not perform as well in the historical period. So we are planning to leave the nutrient limitations on, both nitrogen and phosphorus, for the V2 simulation campaign. What we won't be doing is turning them on and off. And we've learned what the effects of those are in V1, and so we don't need to do that again, but we're planning to leave all of the nutrient limitations on for V2.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, hey Kate, if I could just jump in quickly on that.
Sure.
One thing that the current, because we did CN and CNP, if you do a C only simulation, that's where the really significant differences come in. So either nitrogen or phosphorus tend to bring everything down a lot from a carbon only, but when you have one or the other, then adding the next one doesn't have much impact, it seems like. So we definitely would not want to turn off nutrient limitation altogether. That would give us a very different simulation.
Yeah, and just on this, in this figure that I didn't talk about very much, the looking across all the CMIP5 models for carbon, vegetation carbon. And one of the things they've concluded when they look across all the models is models that don't include nitrogen limitation end up with higher terrestrial carbon than those that do, just on Peter's point.
Great, super helpful.
Yeah, I have a question too. So Kate, so in anticipation of the V2 simulation campaign, when you look at the different energy futures, are there any things that we need to do now in preparation for developing these scenarios?
We just need to choose. So, I mean, it's not hard to configure GChem. Again, I think the problem here is unlike with CMIP 6, when you're using CMIP scenarios, there's 8 to choose from and you just pick. And then you get one radiative forcing level per scenario. And so you're mostly just picking, do I want high or low warming? With GChem, there's an infinite number of possibilities, which has made this more challenging. And so I think we have a general idea of what we're going to do. I just need to finalize that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Hailong.
Hi, Kate. Question about the spin up of the different components. So the ocean will be spun up at the lower resolution, and land and coupled to atmosphere will be at higher resolution. And also you have also a plan for RRM. I wonder, so are those spawn up model runs will be able to be used as initial conditions for like higher resolution or RRM simulations?
So the plan is for both ocean and land to use the low res offline spin up to initialize the RRM in order to save computational time. I think from the ocean perspective, I don't know that people have done this before, but we also don't see any reason why it wouldn't work. And so we're going to try it out. And so then if that works, then I think you could use the low res to initialize a higher res spin up. Again, you still need to run once you move to RRM. You're going to still need to run it for probably at least a few hundred years. Not totally sure exactly how long.
Mm-hmm. So when you couple the land and atmosphere, you also tune, for example, the energy balance and other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Xiaocheng?
Okay, we have been talking about V4. Do you have any idea of utilizing the high resolution atmosphere model we are going to develop for V4? Or you still will rely on the low res E3SM?
I suspect we'll never be able to be as high res as like what Peter Caldwell does, just because adding all the tracers for biogeochemistry slows the model down. I think more of where we've been thinking in going forward is what other things need to be added. And one of the things that came up in a conversation in the fall was, we're doing carbon cycle for, V1, V2, V3, we're going to have methane. We're not really doing, maybe we need to do nitrogen more completely. So we've got nitrogen in land, but we're not really connecting that to the atmosphere right now. And so that might be more of the way we go in V4, or doing things more on coastal or something. But I don't know that super high resolution will work necessarily with all of the tracers, but maybe Mark Taylor has another idea there.
Can I ask my question now?
Yeah, go ahead. I was waiting for Mark.
Okay. Oh,
Go ahead.
So yeah, one more question, Kate. So there is this ongoing carbon conservation deep dive. Does that has any implication for when you might start your V2 simulation campaign? That is, whether you need that carbon conservation to be resolved before you can start the prognostic CO2 type of simulations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Susanna has actually outlined there's a whole bunch of steps within the carbon conservation deep dive, some of which need to happen before we start, and some of which we can wait. So things like we need to know that we're not gaining or losing carbon. Like this is actually something that happened in V1 when Bryce did a bunch of testing of prognostic CO2, and basically we were accumulating carbon because there was a mass conservation issue. And so we can't have that if we're going to spin up or do prognostic CO2. And so those things need to be resolved in advance of starting the simulations. But the things that we can wait a little longer on is like automated tests and things like that. We definitely want to do them before people start doing lots of development so nothing breaks. But there's a set of things that have to happen now, and there's a set of things that can wait a little bit.
Right,
Okay,
thank
the
you.
last question comes from Zhuzhing. She's asking, what's a plan for incorporating marble?
Yeah, sorry about that. I should have mentioned it. We are planning to incorporate marble this summer, so it will be in the V2 model. The only reason I didn't mention it on my key update slide is that it doesn't change the BGC science so much. It's an infrastructure and library change that'll make it easier to update things later. But in terms of reducing biases and ocean carbon uptake, we're not expecting marble to have a big influence there at all.
Okay, Kate, yes, this is for my own understanding. So, yes, marble is offline kind of library. So if there are other individual development, I mean, we'll update the marble, that will E3SM be able to kind of keep benefiting from it?
That is the plan. I think it's
Okay.
not completely, depending on the update in marble, it's not completely automated. We might have to do some more things to connect it in, but the idea would be that we move to marble so that we can take advantage of those benefits in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Ben, I'll load your presentation, and as soon as it's loaded, you may start.
All right, hopefully you can see and hear me.
Yes, we can, thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Ben Bond-Lamberty. I'm here to talk, to wrap up the show, talking about updates on the Energy Land NGD, Next Generation Development, that's been happening forcibly. I'm presenting on behalf of a lot of people, and I'm going to try to call out people who've actually done the work as I go, but apologies if I do miss someone. Forcibly, this is a little bit of a survey, and it's not completely exhaustive, but hopefully I think it hits a lot of the really big areas that have seen big NGD development. Just for the record, I guess I should point out it is actually the 9th of June, not the 8th. So let me start with Kate's slide, which I like so much that I stole it. And when she presented this, what I'm talking about here is this NGD development period that we are sort of 2/3 of the way or so through currently, that's leading us towards the beginning of phase 3 of the model. And another way to look at it is like this. We have a series of developments that have already taken place on the left that have fed into earlier versions, and then we have a lot of ongoing developments, all of which were notionally targeted for V3. Inevitably, I mean, the nature of NGD is that some things are risky, and there are some things out of people's control, and so there are things that have slipped, we know already, to V4, but most of them are still targeted to be available for the V3 model. And the items that are here are largely cover what I'm going to be talking about here, some of the big areas of ongoing development, past and ongoing development, and the rough sequencing when we think, there are two big outputs, sort of, where there's the development and knowledge for knowledge's sake, but then peer-reviewed publications, and then testing in the global scale testing, coupled model testing, and integration into master for a future model. So starting, I guess I want to start with Eva Sinha's work, and she's been working with Beth Juniak and Dan Ricciuto and Kachik Sargsyan on implementing and parameterizing and testing perennial bioenergy crops. And so there are two key words in that title. One is perennial, and these are not annual crops, they're perennial crops. So that actually required some model development. And then also the bioenergy side of it has some unique implications, because these are crops that are then increasingly important in the real world as they're turned into energy. And so this is something, for instance, that GCAM, that Kate was talking about, has focused heavily on as well. And so Eva and colleagues have been working both for miscanthus and switchgrass. They've used again, done model development and parameterization, and tested this, calibrated against observational data, and have a manuscript on this process and on their results close to ready to go at this stage. And the figure here is showing both from Miscanthus for GP, gross primary production on the left, and ecosystem restoration on the right, how the model does relative to the data before and after being calibrated. And they've made some interesting findings about the parameters that are most influential that they've been that the algorithm tweaks most strongly and can bring the model really well overall. This is actually an outdated figure at this point. At this point, the model is really well calibrated against the data, and so their next steps after this manuscript will be a pull request and then a larger scale, probably a continental scale test. I mentioned Beth Juniak on the last slide of Argonne. She is wrapping up work on integrating what's called the FAN model. There's an illustration from the published paper here on the right. And it's a mechanistic model for ammonia volatilization, which is important in a couple respects, but particularly if you're thinking about fertilizer and agriculture and crop models and things like that. And so that is also relatively close to integration after a fairly arduous process. And Beth has also been working on new crops and is planning on the next year several important, globally important new crop types that'll be added to ELM. And rice, sugarcane, and winter wheat. And then the third bullet here on the left, Alan Di Vittorio has, this is a pull request is already open and I think approved, is the ability to prescribe global wood harvest area and pass that from the ELM, the land model, into FATES. This more about FATES later, but the functionally assembled terrestrial ecosystem simulator. And he's also done work working with some of the FATES folks to update on the FATES side for that. And so that'll be a really nice and critical capability for some of the planned things like GCAM work coming down the line. A lot of land use, land cover change information we need to be able to seamlessly move around. Moving, I guess, then to the second broad area. The first broad area I was just talking about was sort of this land energy, and the second broad area on hydrology and plant hydraulics, which in this NGD work. And the first big area that the Mozart river routing model has seen a lot of development this cycle. This slide focuses on Hong Yi and colleagues, Hong Yi Li his team at University of Houston. They've done a lot of work focusing on Mozart sediment, Mozart carbon, and Mozart lake. They've particularly focusing on improving the parameterization of Mozart sediment and incorporating a representation of both POC and DOC, so particulate and dissolved organic carbon leaching from ELM. They have a new global lake geometry data set. And they have a series of manuscripts that have either been accepted or in revision or in late stages in prep. The figure shows one of those. This is a manuscript that's going to be targeted Earth System Science data, and it's a little text on the right side. It's a machine learning method to build a predictive model for sediment particle size, and then predicting that across the continental United States, which is the lower figure. And then they have a series of as well pull requests on this work that over the next sort of 10 months they have sort of scheduled. And I sort of, from in my role as coordinator of Energy Land NGD, I'm increasingly working with the various groups to actually explicitly plan out and schedule pull requests, because and then building things like, again, coupled model testing into their development plans for the next 16 months. Excuse me. Zili Tan at PNNL also has worked on some related areas, and one has a paper just published about erosional nitrogen and phosphorus fluxes that's in ERL, and that work also will be in a pull request to the main model. And then he's really focusing on the E3SM, this lake BGC model. So looking at both how soil erosion and then lake methane emissions and how these lake processes here on the right will play out to interact, with the atmosphere, processes like methane ebullition out to the atmosphere and diffusion. And so that's really going to be a bunch of his focus, not so much model development for the next year as some of that testing work. There's a number of other hydrology and plant hydraulics work as well. Gautam Bisht is leading development of the E3SM, a coupled soil plant hydraulics model. Currently, it's in a standalone site level mode, testing against, I think, University of Michigan Biological Station data, and he's planning then to expand that outward. Teklu Tesfa of PNNL, along with Gautam, has been working on a global watershed data set and has a manuscript in prep comparing watershed-based and grid-based representations of land surface processes. Jinyun Tang has done a bunch of better soil BGC development and working on methane emissions from lakes and wetlands. As part of that, is we're working with Bill Riley, has published a couple of really interesting papers on soil processes, and for instance, examining, for example, looking at how essential plant root nutrient acquisition mechanisms are considered in existing modeling paradigms and strengths and weaknesses of that. And finally, and this is the figure on the right, Yilin Fang has been working with the Fates hydro model, so hydrological plant hydrology in the Fates model, and it's had some issues with numerical stability, and in particular when layers get very thin, and then that resulting in stability issues. And she's been working on a smoothing function option that will interact with a saltwater retention curve and will let you aggregate layers and hopefully improve that stability. So mentioning Fates has come up a bunch of time, and just as a recap, Fates is the functionally assembled terrestrial ecosystem simulator. It is a plant dynamics and demography model that is coupled to a host model, typically CLM or here ELM, and but then has dynamic vegetation and vegetation with demography. And the figure here is looking at sticking sort of transition from plant hydrology. This is Jennifer Holm and colleagues who've been testing here in a boreal site, testing ELM Fates with this plant hydraulics capability and how that changes then predictions, say over an 80-year simulation is what's shown here. And so, for instance, here, this is change in plant functional type biomass due to soil moisture increasing and decreasing. So deciduous trees, there's this orange dotted line here. Deciduous trees increase their biomass basically at the expense of coniferous, of evergreen trees here when under these lower soil moisture conditions. And so this is something now that again, that this capability of plants competing with each other for water, and they're really evaluating and exploring that in Fates. And then planning increasingly, this work is either late stage in prep or submitted, I believe, but then really planning then on increasingly pushing to global scale simulations with this ELM Fates hydro capability and looking at, dynamic plant hydraulics, what kinds of effects play out as you do this, as you have this capability in this demographic model. There's a bunch of other vegetation dynamics work that's in a little bit somewhat earlier stage, I guess, still, but two big areas. The first is the Oak Ridge team has been working in a bunch of areas in the leaf to canopy model of ELM. And so the first sub-bullet here is working with Peter Reicher's group in Minnesota. They've had several improvements and actual long-standing bug fixes predating ELM's existence, actually, to sort of the vegetation physiology. And that Peter Reich and Ethan Butler and company led a paper with Peter Thornton and Oak Ridge folks on that. And then there's active development underway on a leaf to canopy scale SIF model. This is solar induced fluorescence, and it is a really interesting potential proxy for GPP for plant production with some really nice properties, and it's visible from remote sensed satellites, for instance. And so there's a lot of interest in having a model of it in ELM. And finally, here they've also been working on the form and parameterization of currently of plant maintenance respiration. So that as opposed to the respiration that's required to grow, to maintain your biomass, that takes respiration, and how that's done in ELM. And there's just some interesting that can have some significant effects globally, and that work is in review right now. And then, sort of in complementary sense, an LBNL team, Bill Riley and a number of other colleagues have been looking at integrating photosynthesis acclimation to both temperature and CO2 into the ELM photosynthesis model, the big leaf model, as they say. And so, as an example here, the figure on the right is from this work, which is still relatively early stage, but looks at how, if you have different climates and different levels of CO2, how VC max, so the maximum carboxylation velocity in the photosynthesis reaction, how that changes over time in a simulation. And this is really interesting, not just from theoretical terms, but the acclimation. This acclimation can theoretically decrease the demand of what's known as the Rubisco enzyme, key part of photosynthesis. So, in other words, that plays then through to leaf nitrogen content. And so, for instance, that could alleviate. This came up in a question for Kate in the previous talk. That could potentially alleviate some nitrogen limitation in the model if as experimental real-world evidence has shown, there's some degree of acclimation here. And so that's interesting work that remains ongoing there. The LBNL group has also led a bunch of work on working with Jim Randerson's team at UC Irvine on the ELM fire model. And the first bullet and the top row of panels here is about Qingzhu's work to build a machine learning surrogate model for wildfire within the model. And they've had, that's currently in review at GMD, and does a overall really good job of simulating sort of both the total burned area on the upper left, this is versus say in red the GFED observational database, and the seasonality here on the right. I have to say props on data visualization. That's a lovely figure, Ching. And so that's really neat because it has the potential, in a much simpler surrogate model to yield a lot of insight, and then to what kind of simplifications can be made in the more complicated ELM fire model. And then one of, I believe she's a graduate student, they've been working on leading, is under review at Journal of Climate, a study on how fire aerosols affect climate and global GPP. And this work is sort of, there's a figure from it here on the right. In this, they distributed fire emissions from the surface into the upper troposphere using satellite-derived smoke plume heights. And then, what that does, that for instance shifts the balance from direct beam radiation to diffuse radiation, generally good for things like GPP, but it has some other cascading consequences down the line. And so that's in review and really interesting work. Oh yeah, okay. So this is something that moving, I guess, a little. This isn't. It has fallen under the ambit, I guess, sort of NGD, which is this work at the Oak Ridge team and using Summit to do a proof of concept, I guess, you might put it, as what will it take to, both in data terms and in algorithm terms, to run ELM on GPUs on Summit, for instance. And so as part of this work, then they've ported the entire ELM code base to run on the GPU hardware. They've been doing close to a year of extensive testing, verifying sort of bit for bit behavior. And as part of this work, really interesting, Peter Schwartz has led a bunch of refactoring and cleanup, a bunch of unnecessary allocations they realized were taking place in the land model, like data structure allocations, that as a result has both some specific routines are sped up by 50%, but the overall land model, even when running on CPUs, so forget the GPU part for a moment, but even running on CPUs, this refactoring and cleanup work has led to on the order of a 5% speed up. It's also meant that reduced memory footprint lets them put more grid cells on a single device. And the figure here is from Dali Wang's poster last year, and I guess these numbers may have changed slightly, I'm not quite sure, but they're breaking down in terms of, well, okay, how many, currently they have one MPI task per GPU, and they have so many then grid cells are allocated to MPI tasks. So then they're going to be moving to really testing out then the actual running GPU running ELM. Also, as part of that work, and this is just published or just accepted, I think, in Nature Scientific Data, they've produced a series of driving data sets, sort of very high resolution, 1 kilometer resolution over all of North America. And these have been tested with offline ELM V1 simulations. And you can see on the right there, things like temperature and precip and VPD, vapor pressure deficit. And really interestingly, I think they've taken, as part of this, they've taken big areas of Alaska as a testing region because their station density there is relatively low. Observational station density is low, so it's a useful worst case bound in a way for if you're going to assess data quality here. This is probably this is the worst case scenario. It would be something like this, and they're looking at then snowpack observation using the model to simulate snow water equivalent or snow depth and looking at it against observations. And so that is just accepted, I believe, again at Nature Scientific Data. Finally, Michael Brunke and Shubing Zhang and colleagues at University of Arizona have had a couple of really interesting developments that are one, I guess, that's shown here is variable soil thickness, soil depth, which has big effects on annual mean base flow. And so in other words, they have a parameterization or a global map of soil depth then that the model, as opposed to a uniform soil depth globally, that the model is going to use. And they've been testing this performance in different topo units. And base flow is higher, and in particular in mountainous regions. So you can see the relative difference here, particularly shows up in mountainous regions. Not so much. This largely doesn't affect surface runoff, though. The other thing, Shubing Zhang, is they've removed the negative lake runoff, which was a problem in the model, by introducing a virtual lake storage term. And this physically makes sense, and they've been testing this against observed lake water levels in Lake Michigan and Great Salt Lake. And I'm not showing that here, but that's really also useful developments. So recapping then, these are 4 big areas, and I guess 5 maybe if you count the GPU work, the GPU version of ELM, but these 5 then big areas that NGD work in this current phase of the project have taken place, most targeted at this V3 version of the model. And yeah, at this point, I think we'll stop and welcome any questions.
Thanks, Ben. Whole bunch of questions. First from Michael Prather.
Hi, Ben. To you and Kate both. What about the nitrogen cycle? Because it's sort of the whole issue of fertilizers, energy to make it, and then the nitrogen cycle, what comes out of it in terms of feedbacks of nitrous oxide even, or NO. I know this is beyond V3, but are there plans or ideas for this at all in either BGC or ELM?
Well, let me start. The feedbacks question is probably maybe a little more in Kate's department. The in the last phase of model development, there was a big emphasis on biogeochemistry, including nitrogen cycle stuff, and there was a conscious decision based on some external advisors to reweight sort of the NGD at least developments a little bit. And so that area hasn't seen a lot. I mean, I mentioned Beth's work integrating FAN. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, that hasn't seen big development in the NGD space. Kate, do you want to weigh in on, I guess, sort of feedbacks on how the BGC group?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had some preliminary discussions because there are pieces of that are either exist within the model or elsewhere. So like the fan work that Beth's doing is doing a little bit of, moving the nitrogen around on the land. And I think that Peter Hess, whose group developed that initially, had connected it to the atmosphere in CESM. And so it's possible to connect some of that work there. I know Hailong has been working on like nitrate stuff in the atmosphere. There's, nitrogen, so there's little bits and pieces everywhere. And so I think that there's a possibility of doing that in the future. It's just we don't have a concrete plan. I think we've just had other priorities. So for V3, I think we're going to focus on methane. And so I think it would be something we should think about and talk about more since there are those pieces.
Ruby.
Yeah, so this question is about the high resolution data set that you showed, 1 kilometer data set for North America. I'm just wondering whether that data set has been extended to other parts of the world, or can it be extended to other parts of the world?
I guess I'll probably let Peter Thorne really answer this, but I think my quick answer would be it has not. North America was the obvious place to start from because, and I guess it'll be a question of data, data quality and availability. But Peter?
Yeah, that's right, Ben. We wanted to, I mean, the Arctic parts of North America are a good test case for other parts of the world where the data density is really low. So we've now demonstrated that we can get reasonable answers in those low density areas. So it would be certainly possible to extend it globally. And yeah, I think that's something we would like to pursue.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Peter Caldwell.
I have a couple of related questions. So the first question is whether in creating this data set at 1 kilometer for North America, whether you've changed the input data tool chain that screen folk are really struggling at.
I'll take that if you don't mind, Ben. Right now we're kind of doing a bespoke implementation of pulling together that input data stream, in part because the chunking of the data onto the GPUs is going to be we're still testing what the best way to do that is. But in general, there's I think a big need to revisit, especially as we go to 1 kilometer global, the existing tools that we have in the surface data toolkit are not adequate to do that. We need to parallelize that and do some work to make that faster for one thing, and even possible for another thing on our best machines.
Mm-hmm. Okay. These are probably all questions for you, Peter, so get ready. My second question is whether this new GPU-enabled code, is it part of the E3SM master, or is it a separate code base?
Yeah, we would like it to be part of master eventually. The first half of it was the refactoring work that Peter Schwartz has in as a pull request. It's, I think, 1 or 2 days away from being able to integrate. Just have to go through next and get it on master. The second part of that is the GPU implementation part, which he has all on another branch. I would be excited to do some coupled system testing with that and say Scream. I know you reached out to me a little while ago on that and haven't had a chance to respond. But yeah, I think there's a lot we could explore there, and we could provide that branch to you. It'll be a pretty clean branch to work with.
Hey, Peter, just to break in, that Nature Scientific Data paper was just accepted, right?
Yes, it is accepted. Not published yet, but it is accepted in production.
Okay. I think there's probably a lot of interest either if, if you're willing to either post the manuscript on Slack or whenever it does go online. Great.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have another piece of that in prep, which is to take that Nature Scientific Data is looking at the daily data, but we also have done for all of North America the temporal downscaling of that based on GSWP3 temporal information. And so we're writing that up now. But it's like 50 terabytes of data for that input data set for North America, and we have that available.
Okay, Michael, right there.
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't need to bring it up. It's rather for Ben and Kate. The issue is, I presume that the food energy system does include fertilizer and nitrogen in the system when you're running this sort of the energy food parts. I presume. So it's like GCAM, for example, Kate. GCAM will be estimating fertilizer use. I'm not worried about the coupling now, but I presume it's part of the system.
So I guess I'll let Kate answer sort of GCAM details, but there is no, and I don't think in any immediate plans for there to be a coupling on fertilizer. I mean, they're sort of starting with things like land use and water, and I don't know if there's a plan for explicit coupling. But Kate. All right, well, we can get back to you, though, I guess, on that. I can ping her about that question.
No problem. It's offline. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. I want to thank all the group leaders and deputies, because I know the deputies did a lot of the preparation, even though the group leaders themselves gave the presentations for these 2 weeks of presentations for the broader project. Once again, these are all recorded, and I thank everybody for tuning in and paying attention. And with that, we'll sign off, and hopefully we'll have an in-person meeting this fall if the logistics and COVID gods smile upon us for that event. So thanks again. Bye, everyone.